Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching this edition of WION VOA co-production with me, Molly Gambhir. Our top focus in this edition, the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff is warning that the U.S. military must change if it wants to stay ahead of China and Russia. In fact, the general sat down with Voice of America Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb recently to discuss how the Air Force is adapting to the changing threat environment across the world. Take a look.
While the United States was busy fighting wars against Islamist extremists in Afghanistan and the Middle East, Russia and China steadily built up their military power. Russia now flexes those military muscles in neighboring Ukraine, while the Pentagon has dubbed China its greatest threat to national security. Speaking exclusively with VOA, General C.Q. Brown Jr., the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, is warning that the United States cannot be satisfied with its position as the world's superpower if it wants to stay that way.
Our adversaries have continued to advance their capabilities. At the same time, we've been using some of the same capabilities we've been using for the past 3 years. The threat we were up against is not the threat we'll see in the future, and that's why we've got to change.
China has more active duty military personnel than the United States and has spent decades advancing its weapons. In the past few years, the Chinese military has built new aircraft carriers, new fighter jets, and a massive missile arsenal. But while China spent about $250 billion on its military in fiscal year 2022, the U.S. spent nearly 8 times that amount.
It's fair to acknowledge when progress is made by those potential adversaries, but that fact alone shouldn't induce any panic in the United States. We are still relatively very, very capable, the best military force in the world.
Those talking points about military supremacies really are a relic of the past.
Army veteran and defense analyst Bradley Bowman points out that China has methodically and deliberately chosen modernizations specifically designed to defeat the United States in East Asia, the most likely battlefield should war break out over Taiwan. And that could make American ports and bases in the region vulnerable to Chinese attacks.
The Chinese have developed capabilities that are as good, in some cases better than ours. America's military edge in the Pacific has absolutely eroded, and I continue to see China sprinting, while it often seems like we in Washington are slumbering.
The Air Force reveals its newest stealth bomber, the B-21, next month. The B-21 will replace America's B-1 and B-2 bombers, which have been around since the 1980s.
This is why we want to modernize, because we have some aircraft that are from a maintenance standpoint, are a little harder, more difficult to maintain, diminishing resources for parts, and that's the aspect of being able to modernize, so they increase the aircraft availability and ensure we have a ready force.
Even ready for what U.S. leaders hope never plays out. U.S. officials say China wants the ability to invade and hold Taiwan by 2027. And China has said it aims to be a world-class military capable of fighting and winning wars by 2049. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
And Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone with me live from the White House with more on this. Hi, Jessica. China's Xi Jinping had his first series of leader-level meetings in almost 3 years. This was on the sidelines of the G20 summit this week, of course. And the week started with more than 3-hour-long meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden. What more are we picking up on what exactly happened between the two leaders and the kind of discussions that this entailed?
Well, as you know, U.S. President Joe Biden returned to the White House here on Thursday. And when he did, American reporters asked him, look, we didn't see on the White House statement that you brought up things like the COVID origins in China or the mass quantities of fentanyl, a very powerful drug that are pouring across our border that are exported from China. We do know from that White House statement, however, that the president did speak to Xi Jinping about things like human rights, about Taiwan, about Xinjiang, as well as about climate change. In an English language statement on the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, we get this about what Xi Jinping brought up. He said, according to the statement, that he pointed out that the current state of U.S.-China relations do not benefit the world. He also said that the Taiwan question is at the core of U.S.-China relations and is in fact a red line in those relations if it in fact is crossed. And after the meeting, we had a curious situation where Biden brought up the statement that he did not believe that an invasion of Taiwan by Beijing was imminent. We followed up on that. In fact, our VOA Mandarin White House correspondent Paris Wong asked John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, about that. And the response was this, that we don't comment on intelligence matters. So that's as far as we got on that. But we can say certainly that both leaders tried to downshift the tensions in the relationship. And the real test now, of course, Molly, will there be follow-up by their primary designees? And for the United States, that is Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State. Will he in fact go to Beijing early next year, as likely needs to take place to follow up on the promises and the conversations that these two world leaders have had? Molly?
Right. Jessica, there was also that confrontation of sorts between Xi Jinping and the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. What has the fallout of that been like?
Well, I want to show you the video because it's very remarkable. It is really a rare instance of getting a documented case of Xi Jinping, a Chinese leader who does everything very choreographed, of course, confronting a Western leader, and it was all caught on video. It's essentially a viral moment in Canadian-Chinese relations. During the G20, Xi did not meet one-on-one with Trudeau, but he did have a couple of pull-asides in public with Trudeau, and one of those happened on Wednesday. It was later, much of the conversation later appeared in the Canadian press, who quoted Trudeau as saying he told Xi Jinping that he was concerned about Chinese meddling in Canadian elections. Xi confronted Trudeau in this video that you're watching now, accusing him of being insincere, saying that, quote, that's not the way the conversation was conducted. Trudeau then responds saying, quote, in Canada, we believe in open and frank dialogue. Now, this does not advance what's already a very troubled relationship between Canada and China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has since called Trudeau's response, quote, condescending, and denied that Xi was criticizing Trudeau. You remember the real pinnacle, or I should say low, of Canada-China relations happened in 2018 when Canada picked up a Chinese telecommunications official, Wang Manzhou, from Huawei and detained her for a period of time. It ended up resolving in a prisoner swap, but it has certainly gone downhill from there. Molly?
All right, Jessica, stay on with me. Let's also talk about the other big development coming in from the United States. Of course, the midterm elections. Republicans won the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives this week. And the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, announced she will not seek a leadership position in the new Democratic minority. Two of the many changes coming to the new Congress in January. Voice of America's congressional correspondent, Catherine Gibson, getting us more.
Major changes ahead in the U.S. Congress as new lawmakers are introduced on Capitol Hill. For the first time in 4 years, Democrats no longer hold a majority in the House of Representatives.
With great confidence in our caucus, I will not seek re-election to Democratic leadership in the next Congress.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will step aside for younger Democrats to take their turn leading in the minority. Congressman Kevin McCarthy is the Republican nominee to become the new Speaker.
I'm proud to announce the era of one-party Democrat rule in Washington is over. Washington now has a check and balance.
But McCarthy will find it hard to unite his own members behind major legislation as he faces significant opposition from the wing of the party still loyal to former President Donald Trump.
They have to figure out how to have consensus within their own caucus before they can even reach across the aisle. So I think it's going to be a challenging time, for a very thin, majority in the House.
New members of Congress say the narrow majority should force the two parties to work together on bipartisan legislation.
Folks are tired of the extremists on the far left and the far right, and they want people willing to work across the aisle to do what's right.
There's a lot of area of agreement if people are willing to sit down and work towards it.
And any legislation will have to pass a Democratic majority U.S. Senate under the continued leadership of Chuck Schumer.
I have a plea for the Republicans and advice. If you embrace MAGA, you're going to keep losing. You're going to lose more. The embrace of MAGA in 2018, 2020, and 22 didn't work. We welcome you to work with us on a bipartisan basis.
Despite a challenge, Mitch McConnell held on to the Senate leadership position among Republicans while recognizing their failures with voters this election.
Their impression of many of the people in our party in leadership roles is that they're involved in chaos, negativity, excessive attacks, and it frightened independent and moderate Republican voters.
But with a divided government for the next 2 years, the chances of President Joe Biden passing any major legislation are very slim. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
And Voice of America's Jessica Stone is back with us. Jessica, also this week, we saw former U.S. President Donald Trump announcing his bid for the White House. Does he have any endorsements from within the Republican Party yet? What's brewing in the Republican camp as of now?
Such an interesting question, Molly, because many of his close confidants and public supporters have yet to weigh in on that. In fact, some of them, like Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, have refused to do so. But Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama has thrown his support behind the former president. Three major Republican donors, though, have declined to endorse Trump this early in the campaign. That's significant. Even though President Trump has a lot of his own money, these donors did back him last time. They're not weighing in yet on whether they will do so this time. And of course, this comes after disappointing results for the Republican Party, and many of the candidates that Donald Trump endorsed did not do well in this last midterm election. Nonetheless, as Catherine noted, the Republicans lost the Senate, but did not win the Senate, but they did win the House. Even though they're going to have very narrow majorities, they are going to have a majority in the House. In terms of a message from the electorate, though, this was how Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker put it. He's a Republican in a very left-leaning state. He said, look, voters don't want extreme candidates on either side. That was what he said on CNN, that the message was from the electorate. And we also have this from prominent conservative Rich Lowry, who warns that the Republican Party, he says, won't turn against Trump until voters give it clear, unmistakable permission. And so we continue to watch whether or not that happens within the Republican Party in terms of endorsements to Trump and other measures of the Republican supporters' appetite for round 3 of the former president. Molly?
Right, but President Trump is facing numerous investigations, including those connected to actions to overturn the 2020 election, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. How does a presidential run impact those investigations?
Well, it's certainly a question that the Trump campaign is asking, and many of his close advisors have told him that he is immune from prosecution, even though that is not the case. U.S. law says a presidential candidate or sitting president is not immune from prosecution. We are still waiting, though, to hear from the Department of Justice here in the United States on whether they will criminally prosecute the president for trying to overturn the election on January 6th. The New York Times reporting that the Justice Department hopes to have its decision released before this 2024 presidential election really gets underway, because it puts the Department of Justice in a rough spot. They are going to be in the position of prosecuting, if they choose to do so, a presidential candidate who has already claimed he's been the victim of a political witch hunt. In fact, in his announcement of the presidency, he identified himself as a victim. The risk here for the DOJ is that they look like everything that they do is politically motivated, and essentially they've already been attacked with that line from many on the right. Another option, though, here is to appoint a special prosecutor. That's an independent attorney that will investigate. We saw this with Robert Mueller. We've seen this with Ken Starr under the Clinton administration, and that allows a little bit more distance between the Justice Department and a presidential candidate. But we are still in the end of this current Congress before the new Congress is sworn in next January, and that remains to be seen, or it remains to be seen, whether the January 6th committee, which is under the current House, releases any additional information. It will be automatically disbanded when the new Congress is sworn in, so we won't be getting any additional information from them until that point. And again, we're waiting to see what the Department of Justice does, because the president is not immune from prosecution. Molly?
All right, Jessica Stone, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us with those inputs and perspectives. And with that, it's a wrap on this segment and a wrap on the WION VOA co-production.